Good afternoon, everybody. If I could have your attention, please. Thank you all very much for coming to this afternoon's event. My name is Will Barbie, and I am the Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program here at Yale, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our second annual K-12 education panel featuring Mr. Ian Rowe and Superintendent Mike Miles for a panel entitled, "Can Our Public Schools Save Us?" Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 750 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious, conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I also want to emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speakers to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you for joining us in upholding the value of free speech. Now for our guests. Ian Rowe is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, focusing on education, upward mobility, family formation, and adoption. He co-founded Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtue-based international baccalaureate high school in the Bronx, and the National Summer School Initiative. He also serves as chairman of the board at the Child Adoption Center Spence Chapin and is a senior visiting fellow at the Woodson Center. Mr. Rowe leads AEI's Free Initiative, which cultivates a deeper understanding of how family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship weave together a moral fabric that shapes and develops agency in children. The initiative emerged following the publication of Mr. Rowe's book, Agency, the 4-point plan for all children to overcome the victimhood narrative and discover their pathway to power. Mike Miles is the current superintendent of the Houston Independent School District, the 8th largest public school district in the country and the largest in the state of Texas. Before arriving in Houston, Miles served for 3 years as the superintendent of the Dallas Independent School District and 6 years as the superintendent of the Harrison School District in Colorado Springs. Under his leadership, both districts implemented groundbreaking initiatives, established a high-performance culture, and experienced significant growth in student achievement. In addition to his service to public schools, Mr. Miles founded the Third Future Schools, a school transformation system based on fundamentally different principles of operating schools, and committed to preparing students for a year 2035 workplace. Mr. Miles is also a former U.S. Army Ranger and diplomat for the United States to Poland and Russia. He holds degrees from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the University of California at Berkeley, and Columbia University. I hope you all will join me in welcoming Mr. Rowe and Superintendent Miles to the Buckley Institute and to Yale. We will begin with opening remarks from each of our guests before turning it over to the audience for a Q&A session. So, Mr. Rowe, if you'd like to kick us off.
Okay, thank you, William, and thank you, Mike Miles. Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here at the Buckley Institute. Just given what William identified, especially given the mission to improve the culture of free speech and intellectual diversity at Yale. I wish it were happening at many more colleges and universities. I'm also honored to be here with my fellow soldier in the fight for better schools, Superintendent Mike Miles. I had the pleasure of seeing Mike just a couple of weeks ago to learn about the phenomenal work that he is doing in Houston. A while ago, someone described me as the bravest man in education reform for my fights with the teachers union and other things I've been done to try and disrupt education on behalf of children. But I'd be happy to pass the baton to Superintendent Miles for what he has already done, and more importantly, what he is prepared to do to improve outcomes for the children in Houston. As Mr. Harkness said, I join you today wearing two hats. First, as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where I do research on family formation, adoption, education. But my work is not just theory. I put my ideas into action on the ground in the very communities that we are seeking to uplift. So I'm happy to say that my second hat is as the CEO of public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan for the last 15 years. The first 10 years running a network of elementary and middle public charter schools. There we had 2,000 students across 6 campuses, almost all low-income Black and Hispanic kids, where each year, excruciatingly, we had a wait list of about 5,000 families. And now, after running a network of elementary and middle schools, I recognized that the final frontier was running high schools. So I've now launched Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtues-based international baccalaureate network of high schools that we opened in the Bronx in 2022. Now, the reason that I run schools is that I want our students to know that they can do hard things. Even in the face of inevitable challenges, they can lead virtuous, self-determined lives with integrity and agency. The guiding premise is that a self-governing, civil, and free society depends upon that society being populated by individuals who have the ability to self-govern their own attitudes and behaviors that are both constrained by and liberated by a set of common civic virtues. So the first step to ensure that our public schools can save us is to instill this common set of civic virtues. Some may question this point as they believe that schools have no role to play in teaching morals. But here is the reality. If you are running an institution that is with kids 7 to 8 hours a day, then you are in the business of moral formation. And even if you think you are not, you are. The question is whether or not you are being deliberate and intentional regarding what type of moral formation you seek, because that void will be filled one way or the other. And you can put up the slide. At Vertex Partnership Academies, where I run our high school, one of the first decisions we made was to organize the entire school around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. These are called the cardinal virtues from the Latin root cardo, which means hinge, because they are the root virtues upon which all other standards of moral excellence depend. When normed and practiced regularly, these individual behaviors then form the collective basis of a good society, a community that is self-governed by public virtue. And for each cardinal virtue, we require students to memorize what we call I statements as part of their process to internalize their sense of personal agency. So I want you to envision a room of our students in the Bronx, standing strong in their beautiful blazers and ties, reciting the virtues, taking an individual experience and transforming it to be a collective commitment to the principles that we all agree to live by. So I'm going to ask you all to do a favor with me and be like our students. And I want to have all of us read each of these I statements together. So I'm going to say the first word, and then we'll all just read the I statement. Okay? All right. Courage. I reject victimhood and boldly persevere even in times of uncertainty and struggle. It is so amazing when you see our students say these words. You can see the strength. Justice. I uphold our common humanity and honor the inherent dignity of each individual. The reason that's so important for our students, when we say honor the inherent dignity of each individual, that helps us dispel these ideas that your race is the most salient characteristic, or your sexual orientation, or your gender, because we honor the inherent dignity of each individual. Temperance. I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. When we rolled out our cell phone policy, which was to require every kid to put their cell phone, smartwatch, AirPods in a yonder pouch in the morning and lock it for the entire day and not return until the end of the day, we didn't just roll it out as some punitive policy. We rolled it out to support this cardinal virtue of temperance, because we want you to learn the power of self-restraint and self-discipline. Finally, wisdom. I make sound judgments based on knowledge of objective, universal truth. We can get into that one too, but there is truth. We live in a world where it's like my truth, this person's truth, there's sort of a relativism, but sometimes there's actual fact that we need to ensure that our students know. So the idea is, first, our students grasp the virtues here in their head and ultimately in their heart in terms of how they live their day-to-day lives. But beyond virtues, there's something else we need to ensure that our public schools, can save us, and that is to build a sense of civic pride. Atlantic Magazine just published an amazing article by Jean Twenge, The Death of American Exceptionalism. It makes the case that young Americans no longer believe their country is anything special. In the early 1980s, 67% of high school seniors agreed that, quote, despite its many faults, America's system of doing things is still the best in the world. 67% of high school seniors agreed with that statement in the early 1980s. According to the article, that number has fallen to 27% by 2022. I believe we have the moral imperative and responsibility to offer the optimistic view and truth that the American dream is real and it persists, and the history of our country is proof positive. The American story, told in its totality, is a story of inspiration and setbacks, of cruelty and kindness, of adversity and triumph over adversity. Those who seek to teach a sanitized version of American history to achieve some false sense of patriotic education do our country and our students a disservice. And ironically, so do those who cherry-pick the most egregiously cruel acts to weave together a narrative of a permanent American malignancy, of racism, or some other form of oppression. In order to achieve civic pride, to inspire a reverence for liberty and the American experiment, we have to tell the whole story of America, warts and all. Let me close by quoting Alexis de Tocqueville, who said that, quote, the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. I find this statement compelling because it suggests our country, through its founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they have within itself, our country has within itself, the tools of self-renewal, the power of self-betterment, a story that is still yet to be told. At Vertex, our students recite the preamble to the Constitution every day to remind them that we are the people to shape the future. how public schools can save us is for we grown-ups to instill within our students that they also have these tools of self-betterment and self-renewal within themselves. That they live in a remarkable country that is not hostile to their dreams, but in fact can help make those dreams come true if they live with virtue as architects of their own lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
And you
Mr.
can-
Miles.
And you can take that down.
Sure thing.
You know how the first day of school you were supposed to have a syllabus over the summer and do some homework, and then the first day of school people asked you to, tell them what you did, you learned, or on the homework assignment. Well, that's me right now because I didn't get the assignment. But I like the topic, so I'm glad I'm here and really look forward to your questions and a dialogue about this. Like what Ian had to say, but he's a young man, so he's still really optimistic. I have spent my life serving the public interest. That's what I do. I've been a soldier, and then a diplomat to Poland and Russia, and then education. And so I truly support the common good and American values. But I'm not sure the country's the same as what I remember, and the values are the same. I grew up in the era of Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I grew up in a time where the American public education system made some promises. And for many, it worked. Work hard, get a good education, and then you can be whatever you want to be. I'm not sure that's the same way anymore. I'm still going to fight for American public education and for equity and for the underserved kids. But I got to tell you, the odds are longer now. American public education, in my opinion, has not lived up to the promise that it made to me and my generation. I think a lot of that promise has been lost, and I think a lot of people feel that. We still have the same achievement gap as we did 30 years ago. The last 20-some years of NAEP data, National Assessment for Educational Progress, is flat with regard to proficiency of Black and Hispanic students, and white students also. They just happen to be 35 to 30 percentage points higher than Black students or Hispanic students in this country, and that gap hasn't closed. It closed 2 percentage points in 8th grade reading for Black kids, 2 percentage points, being 35 points back, and then lost that during COVID. So I don't know if that promise has held. We're in trouble in the American public education system, and it has not worked. And I think you see that in the graduation rates, but not so much graduation rates, but graduation rates from college, especially the elite colleges. So what has happened? What's wrong with the American public education system, and is there any way to fix it? I think Ian brings out, these values are great. The last one, though, for example, and I can go through each one, but just the last one about objective truth, gee whiz, guys. We have some real issues on defining accuracy, what a fact is. The second biggest problem in America today, according to me, after public education being number one, a failed public education system, is the inability to ensure we understand as a culture, as a nation, what fact and fiction is, what accuracy and inaccuracy, what information and misinformation is. When you can't define what is true, you have all kinds of issues with doing almost everything. How do you have an effective jury system if people can't determine what evidence is, what real evidence is? How do you buy property? How do you buy anything major if you can't discern what the real facts are, what the information is? How do you have an American public education system? How do you become skilled or knowledgeable if there are so many alternative facts and a different reality for much of the information? How do you have politicians write good legislation if they too cannot determine what is fact and what is fiction? So it's a good aspirational thing, and I'm glad your students are doing it, and hopefully that will grow across the country. But right now, that is a huge problem, just one of many for American public education system. The biggest problem, I mean, there's lots. I'll just identify a couple, and then, tell you what I think might be a solution. The biggest problem in American public education system is that we have not changed. We have not kept up. We do piecemeal incremental reform in large urban districts and most districts, piecemeal. And then it goes back and change doesn't happen. There's lots of reasons for that, and happy to get into that with questioning. But our schools have largely not changed. We're still teaching the same curriculum. Reading, writing, math, science, social studies. Not that that's not important. It's still important to read, at least right now. But what about the other things? What about the year 2035 competencies that students need now to get ready for a different world and workplace? I said to my staff, first day I got there a year and a half ago in Houston, this is the last generation of students in public education before the skills gap is locked in. The skills gap. What's happening in the marketplace? What's happening in the workplace? What's happening in the world? What's happening is you have lots of technological advances, the least of which is AI, and maybe not the least, but one of many is artificial intelligence changing the workplace. Lower skilled jobs are leaving. Middle income jobs are leaving a little bit, or lower skilled jobs are growing. Middle income jobs and middle skilled jobs are leaving. High skilled jobs will still be there, but they're changing. And so you have a whole society, economic society, that is going to rely on low skilled jobs. And higher skilled jobs are going to get worse and worse. And there may not be anything wrong with that in American public education. My friends say to me, Mike, only 35-40% of the kids can read at grade level. 60 to 65% of all the jobs in America be low-skilled gig economy jobs. And most of the gig economy jobs are low-skilled, low-wage. So it kind of fits. What's your deal, dude? My deal is that may be okay, except that what we see right now, and maybe in the future, is that the poor black and brown kids, the underserved kids, will be relegated more to the low-skilled jobs. And if that's okay in a society, given Ian's four moral concepts, I don't think it is. I don't think that's okay. I don't think it's okay when a kid enters school that the promise of America is that, your diploma won't mean much, but you will be able to get a low-skilled job. And by the way, the wealthier will have predominantly the high-skilled jobs, or people with means. There are always exceptions. There's 50 million students in America in K-12 education. Of course, even if there's 5 percentage points are exceptions, that still leaves a whole bunch of kids who are not getting the education they need, not getting the skills they need. So what to do real quick? We have to not only teach kids how to read, write, and do math at higher levels, which is hard enough, but we also have to help them with year 2035 competencies. For example, critical thinking, information literacy, problem solving. In Houston, we have an Art of Thinking course. We're the only district in the country, I believe, that requires this for 3rd through 8th grade, 3rd through 10th grade. Art of Thinking, 3 times a week, 90 minutes each time. It includes information literacy, problem solving, critical thinking, so that we can do the 4th moral of Ian's list. Become more intelligent consumers of information, discern fiction from fact, fallacies of logic, bias. Read a research report the other day, research from a university. Most of their citations, 80%, were from newspapers, which were already biased. That's research? I hope you don't do that at Yale. I mean, there's nothing wrong with quoting, a source, even a newspaper, if it's accurate and well-founded, but not if it's just somebody quoting, a blogger in the newspaper. So that's one thing we have to do. We have to get ready for that. We have to focus on things like artificial intelligence in the workplace. We have to focus on prompt engineering. We have to focus on problem solving. We need courses designed for that, not just reading, writing, math, science. So we've got a long way to go. My sense is that the traditional districts will not do what I just described, will not do what Houston is doing. Houston is an outlier right now. In just a year and a half, just in reading, writing, math, science, and the regular stuff, we are knocking it out of the park compared to all the other districts in Texas. And we're, like I said, we have Art of Thinking. We're doing AI. We started this last year, or this year, AI in the workplace, AI in the classroom, for both students and teachers, and many things like that. But I think the American public education system is going to be late to the game. This is the last generation of kids in school before the skills gap is locked in. The thing to do right now is get ready and put in place the things we need to do to save the next generation. That's all I have.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you for your excellent and very insightful remarks from both ends of the education spectrum. I suppose I'll open it up with just a few questions before offering it all to you. Superintendent Miles, you mentioned about how when you were coming up in the world, we had the Kennedy idea of a promise to America, especially in the American education system. Just, I guess, last year when Vivek Ramaswamy was running for president, the office of president, he ran, part of his platform was on dismantling the Department of Education at a federal level. So I'm very interested to know how I suppose both of you view the Department of Education, if being insiders, right? Vivek Ramaswamy is obviously not an educator himself, he's a politician. So how does the Department of Education fit into the actual boots on the ground, local communities, public school communities who benefit from it, or is it seen as a total bureaucratic overreach at this point?
Two things. Number one, the real issue is whether or not we believe in the promise of American public education system and whether or not we want to invest in it. And so the Department of Education is an institution, if well run, can emphasize and support public education. And not just public education. It can be charter schools, which is also public education, by the way. All kids need a good education, don't get me wrong. So public education writ large, I think there needs to be federal investment. There has to be a belief and a messaging that this is something we value, and we also value it in order to serve underserved kids. And we should have public education also be conscious of equity. Number two, how you do it is important, but we need to make sure that the Department of Education, which I believe should still exist, do it in a way that invests more money than the 7 or 8% that we get right now. Used to be a lot more, by the way, in Kennedy's time. So that we invest in our schools and we do it in an effective way. I do believe, and this is not contradictory. We, public educators, we who spend public dollars, need to be accountable for that. Meaning there has to be some guardrails so that we don't just waste it. I won't go into it long, but the ESSER money, the COVID relief money, largely wasted by the American public education system. Not by me personally, but I'm part of that system, and it was largely wasted, and there's been little accountability. So yes to the Department of Education.
And I would say, so Mike cited some data before from the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is also known as the nation's report card. And if you look at that data, as Mike said, it's basically flatlined since the very earliest times of the assessment was given, I think in 1992. But it's also damning evidence of the effectiveness of the Federal Department of Education, because I think it was formed in 1980, and it's really hard to make the case that its existence has resulted in significant improvements in the education of kids. And what's also interesting about what Mike said, he talked about the fact that it's been flatlined, where basically Black and Hispanic kids are like this, white kids are like this over time. But what's interesting is that when you look at white kids' performance, this flatlining actually occurs below 50%. In the entire period that the National Assessment for Educational Progress has been given, there has never been a year at 4th grade, 8th grade, that a majority of white kids are reading at grade level or reading at NAEP proficiency level. So we have an across-the-board issue. So I think it is very right to question, what are we doing with the Federal Department of Education? Especially when you look at top-down mandates that, in my view, have hurt what's happening at the local level. So No Child Left Behind, I was working at the White House at the time that was passed, had some great aspirations to ensure that, logically, we should ensure that every kid through 3rd through 8th grade, there's some mechanism to assess whether or not a state is doing a good job, to determine whether or not kids are reading and doing math at grade level. That's a completely reasonable policy objective. The way it played out, though, on the local level, is that you started to see, like, for example, in New York State, because English language arts and math became the coin of the realm, suddenly history was displaced, and so there was no longer a history exam at the state level. You started to see the disappearance of history in elementary curriculum. You saw the disappearance of science. So you would go from an elementary school curriculum where you've got science, 45 to 60 minutes per day, to maybe 1 or 2 days per week. So there's a big disconnect often with lofty federal top-down objectives to how things actually play out at the local level. And so those are things also I think we have to think critically about. In my view, some of the things that a federal Department of Education can do, I think effectively, are to create positive incentives for what we want states to do, and then disincentives for what we don't want states to do. So for example, in New York State, under the Obama administration, there was something called Race to the Top, where the federal government dangled, I think it was something like close to $700 million, and New York State won it. But the way in which they proved that they were worthy of that money was that they showed, we're going to have X more charter schools. We're going to have X more opportunities for choice. We're going to have far more opportunities for individual families to be able to have more high quality educational opportunities. To me, that makes sense. Where federal level, you're not putting down a mandate, you're saying these are the behaviors, these are the things that we think are good for kids. More choice, education savings accounts, vouchers, religious institutions being able to run schools, if parents that's what they want, homeschooling. So to the degree that the Federal Department of Education persists, I think investment is the right word. Some people sometimes interpret that all sorts of ways, but tying it to behaviors we want, and then creating, in my view, consequences for behaviors that we know are harmful to kids, such as cutting off choice and making it so, like the school that we just launched Vertex in, of the 2,000 or so kids that live in that district that start 9th grade, 4 years later, only 7% of kids graduate from high school ready for college. Meaning 93% start 9th grade, either drop out over their 4 years, or they do graduate, earn their high school diploma, but still cannot do math nor reading without remediation if they were to go to high school. And so, but in New York City, right now there's a cap on charter schools. You couldn't open a new school if you wanted to serve that 93%. We were actually sued by the teachers union when we opened our school, and thankfully we won. You know, sometimes David beats Goliath, but that would be an example of behavior that we want states not to do, to restrict choice, especially in those communities that don't have very many good options currently.
Thank you both very much. Just one final question for me so the audience can start thinking about their own questions. To provide some context, recently in Houston, where Mr. Miles serves as the superintendent of the independent school district, a bond of $4.4 billion was put to the Houston voters, which would have gone to funding infrastructure and building new buildings in the school district, and 60% of voters rejected the bond. Superintendent Miles, you claim that this was an example where the politics of adults beat out the needs of our children. Mm-hmm. I'm very curious from both of you, which political actors or which groups are the ones that make these matters so difficult to actually benefit the children? Like, where is this political divisiveness coming from?
Yeah, it's more than just political actors. It's more than just politics. Two quick thoughts. Number one, a bond referendum or election is a clear decision for a community to either put kids first or some other interest first. I'm not saying those interests that is other than the kids passing the bond is bad. Some people don't want to raise, even though the bond wouldn't have raised their property tax, it is an indebtedness that gets paid out over a longer period of time. Some people don't like that. Others don't think that the union interests are being met by other things that we're doing. So you either, if you go to a building, and just for context, the Houston Independent School District hasn't passed a bond since 2012 for high schools, and for elementary and middle hasn't passed a bond since 2007. Most large districts pass a bond every 5-6 years. So think about 40-year-old portables. I'll give you one school, Bonham Elementary School, 1,100 Hispanic students, and half of them are in these trailers. Trailers that have been there for 40 years. Houston is a humid climate. The wood is rotting in those trailers. We don't have enough capital improvement money to replace them. We have 1,000 trailers, portable buildings in Houston, 1,000. And the bond would have only gotten rid of half of them, et cetera, et cetera. But that should have nothing to do with politics. But what it does have something to do with is this slow march of inequity over decades. It creeps up on you. When you think about, let's not talk about Houston, let's talk about any large urban district, and the facilities for kids who are underserved and the facility for kids who are not, which happens over decades. We can talk about why underserved kids have the least experienced teachers, how the most effective teachers are not in the schools with the lowest performing students. I hear my colleagues talk about equity all the time. You know, we want to do equity. We want to be equitable, and it's in value statements. And I ask them just one question: have you put your most effective teachers with your lowest performing schools? If the answer is no, then don't talk to me about equity. So that's a long way to say it's not just politics, it's just a culture where we have not, overall in the country, attended well to really putting kids first. If you get, we can go long on this, but I'm going to stop. Really think about what that actually means and what you need to do to put kids first.
Excellent.
Ditto. No, schools unfortunately have the burden of being the place where lots of social issues converge. And I think there's often an expectation that schools have to sort of single-handedly figure these things out. So things like bonds are important, but the reason those portables have been sitting there for 40 years has a lot to do with many things beyond just improving quality of instruction. So I was disappointed when I saw that, because I knew that was a key part of your strategy. So ditto.
Right. Well, thank you both for your thoughtful answers. I'll now turn it over to the audience. So for those of you who have some questions, I'll come around and hand you the microphone.
Thank you. Oh, cool. Sounds good. Thank you both for your service to our country and also for coming and speaking with us today. I want to ask a related question to Mr. Barbie, which is about how potentially kind of structural facets of our political system can maybe affect this culture where we put maybe children second to other issues. And what I mean is, when we look at elections, it seems like voters kind of always care about other issues first: economy, immigration, healthcare, these sorts of things. I think part of that might be because blocs who really do care about public education, like teachers' unions or parents with school-age children, are losing political influence within both parties and maybe at a national scale. And so my question is, like, one, if either of you think there are kind of structural political reasons which impact how we view education and how much support federal education programs get. And two, if so, how maybe could reforms to our political system impact education and our culture more broadly?
You can go first.
Sure. Unfortunately, kids don't vote. And fundamentally, I think that's it. So when you're talking economy, inflation, immigration, those things clearly affect children, but they affect adults more. Pocketbook issues. So I think adults who vote are generally voting for their interests, which are unfortunately not always connected to the future of our society. That said, I think most people do care about our public education system. Employers certainly care about it. There was a movement 20, 30 years ago with top business leaders partnered with government to at least try to figure out better relationships between the workplace and the school force. I think in this election, while it wasn't spoken about, I know that the big headline is "Let's eliminate the Department of Education," but there was a subheadline which was every parent should have the opportunity to send their kid to a great school. And I do hope that that is something that manifests itself coming out of this administration. Again, whether it's charter schools, vouchers, education savings account, money for homeschool parents, that there is a mechanism that if you live in District 12 in the Bronx, where only 7% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, you have some outlet. Whenever I'm in this conversation with someone who's anti-choice and all that, I'm like, look, I have a 22-year-old mom. When I was running elementary and middle schools, I had a 22-year-old mom. She had a kid at 17. For whatever reasons, whatever she may have faced in her life, she wants a shot for her kid, and she doesn't have time to waste. And if she's in a district where only 7% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, what do you tell her, you know? And so my hope is that choice is something that I think most Americans can agree upon, and whatever configuration happens with this federal Department of Education, there is a huge incentive to expand this idea of high quality school choice.
Your question cuts to the core of public education and part of the problem with it, politics. The union, and mind you, I'm registered independent, support the right of people to assemble, but the union has been one of the biggest obstacles to successful education. Why? Because they are part of the status quo, and we know we need to change, but it doesn't matter. They're not about innovation, they're about status quo, they're about protecting all teachers, even the teachers who do bad things or who cannot teach. Ian just quoted part of a phrase of, I think it was Weingarten, said, you know, when, or no, not Weingarten.
Oh, Al Shanker.
Shanker, who said, you know, when kids can vote, then I'll start listening to them. In the meantime, I'm going to listen to teachers. You know, that's not putting kids first. And that's all about, and politics are such that people don't want to vote against the union or, you know, or gain their ire, so we go to the lowest common denominator. That's a problem. The solution may be choice. I ran a network of charter school. I founded and ran for 8 years a network of charter schools called Third Future Schools, right before I became the superintendent at Houston. And we had a board. It was not an elected board, so it wasn't political. And it is, you know, knocking it out of the park for kids because they actually do put kids first. So we're not beholden to a bunch of politicians or union members, and we just focus on what we need to do for kids, seriously. And that may be the solution for the country writ large.
Thank you both for coming to speak. My question is more for you, Mr. Rowe. In your Vertex program, it seems that we are trying to build a virtue-based moral system of education. And my question is, at least through my own understanding and experience, virtue and morality are not taught through school. They are taught through other institutions, through the communities, such as the church, or for me it was the Boy Scouts of America. Why is it important for us to invest in teaching morality in these schools instead supporting these other institutions that should play a part in the development of kids?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and even in my opening remarks I said not everyone believes that schools should even be attacking this issue at all, because you know, kids should be learning these morals or values at home or in church or the Boy Scouts or other institutions. So first off, as I said, if you're with kids 7 to 8 or more hours a day, whether you like it or not, you are in the moral formation business. If you choose to do nothing, then you are putting that forth in terms of what is important to kids, and we just think that's an abdication of responsibility. The other reality is that, unfortunately, the institutions through which kids learned many of these values are diminishing importance. Like Boy Scouts of America, look at the, read Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. All the community-based institutions that were so crucial are just not playing the same role. Religious institutions, particularly amongst young people, the highest growing category of religiosity amongst young people is nuns, right? N-O-N-E-S. And there was just a study that just came out today about suicide rates being higher in terms of young people who describe themselves as having no religious affiliation. So we just think we would be doing our kids a disservice if we didn't talk about the importance of having some kind of moral framework for decision making. So we have this concept called the life deciding decade, right? Age 14 to 24. Basically, the decisions that you make during that period of time around things like your education, relationships, family formation, faith formation, while not fully determinative, will have a huge impact over the quality of the rest of your life. So how do we equip our students in high school as they embark upon this life-deciding decade, that they have some framework of how to assess a problem? What does it mean to be courageous or act with temperance? You know, like how do I turn these nice words into actual day-to-day behaviors and decision-making? So for us, again, after having run a school for 10 years and just seeing, in many communities, like, we're it. You know? We're it for our kids. And we've got to take that responsibility very seriously.
Can I, my challenge with it, Ian, would be whose morals?
For sure.
I agree with the ones that you have, but those are my values, and I would be kind of worried thinking of some people out there, leaders, who would have a different set of morals taught with public dollars. You know, I don't want to get too political or too antagonistic with any group, so I won't mention any names or say any morals, but you can imagine different set of values using public dollars to teach kids different values.
Yeah.
That would be my only footnote and concern. I like the ones you have, and I hope they get expanded,
Yeah.
but
And it's
I just worry about the other footnote.
Yeah, it's a very fair question. And for what it's worth, we didn't make these up, right? We looked at a lot of research and history of what has contributed to this idea of human flourishing. And the cardinal virtues, we believe truly, are at the root of almost all other virtues that we care about. So it's a very, very important point that Mike is making. We're not just pontificating because of some idea that came up, 3 weeks ago about these are the virtues that we're pushing.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you guys for coming out to talk, and then also specifically for you guys' dedication to charter, because I was that child of that, single mom that ended up going to charter school, and I attribute a lot of my success to the success that they pushed me to do and to achieve in my schools that I went to.
Wow.
So
Where was that?
I went to Miami Lakes Middle School in the Miami, Florida area.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was, yeah. But yeah, so that middle school pushed me a lot in the charter area, but then I ended up moving to a rural area. I ended up going to a impoverished rural high school, and I kind of got both sides of this story here, which I think was great, because that leads me to the question of, coming from that rural high school, I firsthand experienced and saw the way that the government was giving the school funding, and I saw how the school was choosing to spend that funding, and was involved with helping them, decide, what to do with it. And so I helped spearhead an after-school tutoring program and stuff in my high school, to which the problem became no one would show up. And so
No students
like
would show
no
up?
students would ever show up. And so I wanted to know you guys' opinion on kind of tackling the battle socially and culturally amongst, people not in these charter schools and stuff, and getting them to make use of these, funding opportunities given to them. Yeah.
Yeah, good question.
Sorry?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's hard. I've gotten in trouble because when I started running charter schools, I thought, just run a great school. That's, have great academics, great math, great principals, great leadership, great curriculum. And like in places like in the Bronx or Houston and many rural parts of the country, you run into the reality of all the other things going on in the lives of children that makes it very difficult for us to meet the promise of what schools are supposed to do. And I mean, I won't go into the full story, but one of the things I write about a lot is how changes in family structure have had a huge impact on the outcomes that we see in public education, particularly the growth of non-marital birth rates. Now it's across the board, but the non-marital birth rate to women 24 and under in the United States is 70%. It's 90% in the black community, it's 60% in the white community, so it's what I call an equal opportunity tsunami, And it's important to say that just because a child is born to a single parent, that doesn't mean they're doomed to a life of failure, nor does it mean if a child is born to a married, two-parent household, are they guaranteed success. So it's very important to say that, but the data is overwhelming that the life chances of those kids in those two different situations, especially if you're already in poverty, are dramatically different. So we teach things like the success sequence in our school. Anyone know what the success sequence is? A few people. So that's just data that says if a young person finishes, and again, this is during the life deciding decade, if you finish at least a high school degree, then get a full-time job of any kind, and then just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if you have children, if you get married first, 97% of millennials who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty, and the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. We think that's really important to teach, especially like in our community where the non-marital birth rate is 86%, right? So our kids aren't seeing that kind of behavior. And we think that matters to helping young people make the kinds of decisions that will break the cycle so that even if, those kids who are not showing up, we work with their parents to get them to show up and then say, these are the kinds of decisions that can change the reality that you're living in. But there's no easy answer to this question other than we have to be super aggressive with parents, make the proposition for why coming to school every day is of huge value to your child. I mean, one of the things we haven't really talked about, we also make the proposition to our parents that college doesn't have to be the only immediate option after high school. So even this weekend, we had 50 of our students go to Northwell Hospital in White Plains in New York because we have a course of study in our high school called biomedical science where our kids can get credentialed in things like phlebotomy at the end of high school. So we want to create this idea that there are multiple pathways to make the proposition that we're offering to kids more compelling for them to come in the first place.
So briefly, I don't know that much about rural schools, but in America today, we have millions of students who have dropped out of school. They have not returned from COVID. So there was huge enrollment decline, and that decline has continued across the country. Part of it is, as Ian said, about we need to make sure that we show students that we're adding value. But I think many students are deciding for themselves, look, low-skilled jobs, I need that much more skill to get a higher paid job, high wage, high skill. So the gig economy is in a symbiotic relationship with students who are dropping out, meaning it's easier to drive an Uber at 17 than to finish school, if that finishing school doesn't get you any high skills. So that gig economy is growing, people delivering packages, people driving an Uber, people just doing any number of things that is really short, more geared towards their lifestyle maybe, but isn't high wage, isn't high skill.
Time for one final brief question.
Oh, really? That's a
lot of pressure. Yeah, I wanted to thank you both for being here today and for your wonderful responses. I think the question I have is what metrics through which we should be determining success? Because both of you talk about critical thinking and cultivating morality. To me, these feel like more nebulous, obviously, than reading and writing and math. But obviously, y'all said that there are also some issues and gaps there. So I guess, yeah, what do you think are the effective ways we can be quantifying these benefits?
So it's a very good question, right. So our courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom, it's not as if there's an exit exam at the end. And we do care about scores in reading and math and history. So it's not, so in showing the importance of the virtues, which is certainly the anchor for our school, that doesn't diminish the importance of us holding ourselves accountable to seeing, high percentages of our kids doing really well on these exams, because we know that that is a ticket to entry to the next leg of success. So I would say, like even when I said before, No Child Left Behind set these very reasonable objectives, just how much of the education establishment responded, like overemphasizing only ELA and math to the exclusion. I don't know what you feel about that, but only to the exclusion of things like social studies and science and the arts and all the other things that are supposed to make schools great. So I think there is a way to both hold accountability over the hard stuff, math, science, ELA, while creating an enriching environment around arts, virtues. I mean, this is what we're trying to do at our school, and I think can be done nationally.
So I'm happy to see a person asked about metrics, because in our profession, we've kind of gone away from that. We've moved away from accountability. People call it the A word. Without accountability, though, you cannot maximize your effectiveness. So almost everything we do in Houston and in every effective school district, it is tied to something that can be measured. So even critical thinking, the art of thinking class that we have, has an exam, beginning, middle, and end of year, so that we can gauge whether kids have learned fallacies of logic, whether they can identify bias in a text, those sorts of things. So those are quantifiable, and we try to do that. Reading, math, and science, of course. Principal evaluations, teacher evaluation, my evaluation are all tied to outcomes. Even leadership, which is kind of a nebulous concept, we have a clear rubric and a training regimen to assess principals on their leadership. So we're all about that, and we're all about accountability. People who can't get the outcomes won't be long in our system. Same with me. That's the first thing I said the first week. If I can't get the outcomes, hopefully in a couple of years, I said, but I should be fired. Luckily, we got it in the first year, incredible outcomes, so I'm still here. Fortunately or unfortunately for some.
And you still value the arts and music.
Oh yeah.
There you go. Well, I apologize for not being able to get to everybody's questions, but that concludes the end of our programming for this afternoon. We'll be around for another 15 minutes or so in order for people to be able to come up and ask our guests questions. But please join me in thanking both of them for coming to Yale today.
Thank you, guys.